Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating excerpts you sent over from Noam Chomsky's Rethinking Camelot.
Oh, yeah, this was going to be good.
It really digs into some controversial aspects of U.S. foreign policy, especially around the Vietnam War and the Kennedy administration.
Right.
Many people remember the Kennedy years as this kind of idyllic Camelot, but Chomsky, well, he challenges that perception, and that's what we're going to explore today.
And he does it so well. What really strikes me about Chomsky is how he takes this romanticized image of Camelot and just dismantles it piece by piece.
Yeah.
He uses declassified documents, historical records. Like, he's not just throwing opinions around, he's bringing the receipts.
It's like detective work, almost.
Exactly.
And one of the most shocking things he brings up is this whole idea that JFK was secretly planning to withdraw from Vietnam.
Right, that's a popular belief.
Which so many people believe.
But Chomsky argues that it's just not supported by the facts. He goes through Kennedy's inner circle communications, public statements, even internal planning documents.
Wow.
And it's interesting, what he actually finds is a pattern of escalation by JFK, not a plan for withdrawal.
And he doesn't shy away from specifics. Like, he points to this big shift from supporting the Diem regime's tactics, which, were brutal,
Absolutely,
to say the least, to authorizing direct U.S. Air Force attacks.
Huge change.
The huge change.
And a devastating one for the Vietnamese people.
Right.
Chomsky really highlights that human cost, citing some statistics that are honestly pretty shocking.
Yeah.
It makes you look beyond all the political maneuvering and really confront the impact, the real impact of these decisions.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay.
Because Chomsky doesn't just analyze Vietnam in isolation. He puts it in this broader context of global power dynamics and the history of, powerful nations intervening around the world.
He's got this concept he calls the vile maxim.
Right, the vile maxim.
This idea that powerful nations, they're driven by this relentless pursuit of wealth and power, often at the expense of others. And, well, it's not a pretty picture.
No, it's not.
He argues that this principle has been fueling, European conquest for centuries, and it continues to shape U.S. foreign policy today.
So applying this vile maxim lens to Vietnam, Chomsky is essentially saying that the war, while costly for everyday Americans, ultimately served the interests of a select few, a powerful few.
Yeah, tough pill to swallow, but that's Chomsky for you.
It is a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah, just let us off easy.
But he doesn't stop there. He also digs into how propaganda was used to sell the war to the American public.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other layer.
Like how the Cold War was often used as this catch-all justification for interventions, even when the real motives might have been totally different.
Right, like he uses the example of Indonesia's invasion of East Timor to illustrate this point.
Wow.
He argues that if we only focus on that Cold War narrative, we miss the U.S.'s own complicity in that situation. Right. It raises this important question. How often do we just accept the narratives we're given without, really digging into the evidence?
It's a question we should all be asking, especially today when we're bombarded with information from all sides.
All the time.
So, beyond the Cold War rhetoric, what does Chomsky say were the true motives behind the U.S. intervention in Vietnam?
Well, he argues that the U.S. was really concerned with preventing the spread of radical nationalism.
Okay, so we need to define this term.
Yeah.
Because radical nationalism, in Chomsky's context, refers to governments or movements that embrace socialism or communism.
Right, and during the Cold War, the U.S. saw these ideologies as a direct threat.
Right, to their global dominance.
Absolutely. It was like a domino effect they were afraid of.
So it's like they were afraid of a virus.
He even uses that term, the virus.
Rare virus, yeah.
Yeah, he argues that the U.S. saw successful socialist models, like North Vietnam at the time, as something contagious, something that could spread to other countries in the region and threaten their interests.
Their economic and political interests.
Exactly. So containing this virus, even if it meant devastating a country like Vietnam, was seen as essential.
So from the perspective of those in power, Chomsky argues that the U.S. achieved a certain level of success in the war, even though it came at this tremendous human cost.
It's a chilling way to look at it, but it makes you think.
It does.
About whose interests are really being served in these conflicts.
It does make you think about that.
Yeah.
Now, we can't talk about the Vietnam War without addressing the domestic response here in the U.S.
Right.
Chomsky points out that there wasn't a lot of public opposition to the war initially.
Yeah.
It took a while for the anti-war sentiment to gain traction.
Why do you think that was?
Well, Chomsky brings up this concept of the Vietnam Syndrome.
Okay.
To explain it, he argues that the brutality of the war crimes, the atrocities, all contributed to this growing aversion to war among the American public.
Like a collective trauma almost.
Yeah, like a collective trauma.
Shifting public opinion.
And he's pretty critical of the media's role in all of this.
Oh, how so?
He argues that for a long time, the media didn't really critically examine the government's narrative about the war.
Right.
They presented this sanitized version of events, downplaying the brutality.
Right.
Focusing on supposed progress.
It wasn't until later, when the true cost of the war became undeniable, that the media started to challenge that official line.
So we're back to this issue of propaganda and the importance of being critical consumers of information.
Absolutely crucial.
And this brings us to a really fascinating part of Chomsky's analysis.
Okay.
He digs into the attempts to kind of rehabilitate Kennedy's image after the war.
The resurgence of Camelot.
Yeah, the resurgence of Camelot.
It's fascinating.
It's like people wanted to hold on to this idealized vision of JFK, despite all the evidence that contradicted it.
They wanted that fairy tale.
Yeah, and there were very deliberate efforts to reshape his legacy. Chomsky specifically mentions Arthur Schlesinger Jr.
Oh, yeah, one of Kennedy's close advisors.
Who wrote extensively about the Kennedy presidency.
Right, and he really pushed this idea that JFK was planning to withdraw from Vietnam.
Right.
And was maybe even assassinated for that reason.
But Chomsky picks apart those claims, right?
Oh, he does, meticulously.
Yeah.
He uses his analysis of those internal planning documents to show that these theories, they just don't hold up.
It's like he's anticipating the arguments that would later fuel that whole Kennedy revival.
Right.
And he's addressing them head on.
He's not afraid to take on those revered figures.
No, he's not.
And challenge their interpretations of history.
It's a reminder that history is always being contested, you know?
Yeah.
Always open to interpretation.
Absolutely.
And we need to be wary of those attempts to rewrite the past to suit certain agendas.
We can't just take things at face value. We got to dig deeper.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
After dissecting the Camelot myth, analyzing U.S. foreign policy, exploring the power of propaganda, what does Chomsky ultimately see as the long-term impact of the Vietnam War?
Well, he points to the economic, political, and cultural consequences.
Right.
I mean, the war had a profound impact on all aspects of American society, and those effects are still being felt today.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is his focus on the efforts to reshape the narrative of the war.
Right. It's like the battle over how we remember Vietnam is still going on.
It is. It's ongoing. And Chomsky's work is a powerful reminder that we can't just passively accept the narratives we're given. We have to engage. We have to be critical.
We have to think for ourselves.
Exactly.
It's amazing how Chomsky really gets into the weeds with this. You know, he doesn't just skim the surface.
Oh, absolutely. He digs into those primary sources, the actual documents, you know, the memos, the meeting minutes.
It's like he's piecing together a puzzle.
Exactly. And that's how he uncovers some really surprising things. Like, did you know there was actually a lot of internal dissent within the U.S. government about the Vietnam War?
Wait, really? I always thought it was a pretty unified front, at least among the top people.
That's what we often hear. But Chomsky shows it was way more complicated than that.
Yeah.
There were voices of caution, even within the military, who saw how messy the situation was and warned against getting the U.S. more involved.
You're kidding. Like, give me an example.
Okay, so he mentions General David Shoup,
Okay.
the Marine commandant during the Kennedy years.
Wow.
He was totally against sending ground troops to Vietnam.
A Marine commandant against a war? That's kind of wild.
It is, and he didn't hold back, you know. He called it, and I quote, a lousy, rotten, unwinnable war.
Wow, straight shooter.
Not exactly what you'd expect from a top military official, right?
So it wasn't just like a fringe group of anti-war activists who were worried.
Right.
There were serious doubts from within the establishment itself.
Exactly. But those voices were often ignored or pushed aside.
Wow.
The dominant story, you know, both in the government and the media, was all about being totally committed to winning.
It's like there was pressure to go along with it, to present a united front, even if there were all these disagreements behind the scenes.
That's what Chomsky argues. And he thinks this pressure to conform was partly because of the Cold War ideology.
Right, that good versus evil mentality.
Yeah, that black and white worldview that made it hard for policymakers to see the nuances of what was really happening in Vietnam.
So he's saying that this rigid ideology, it kind of blinded them to the realities on the ground.
Absolutely. It made it easier to justify things they might have questioned otherwise.
Which is why his work is so relevant to us today, you know? He makes us think about how ideology even now can distort our understanding of the world.
It could be used to justify things that aren't in our best interests.
Yeah, it's a wake-up call for sure.
A call to be critical thinkers.
Okay, so we've talked about Chomsky dismantling the Camelot myth, his analysis of U.S. foreign policy and the Vietnam War, this whole idea of critical thinking. But what about the actual events surrounding Kennedy's assassination?
Oh, right, the big mystery.
Does Chomsky get into that at all?
He does touch on it.
Okay.
But his main focus is on the policy debates of the Kennedy years and that broader historical context of U.S. interventionism.
Right.
He does address some of the conspiracy theories, though.
Okay.
Especially the ones that say there was this big plot to stop Kennedy from withdrawing from Vietnam or, making other big changes.
So what's his take on those theories?
Well, he's pretty skeptical, to be honest.
Okay.
He says there's no real evidence to back them up.
Yeah.
Chomsky's all about separating speculation from actual evidence,
Right.
He's not buying into those narratives that don't have a solid foundation in facts.
So he's not convinced that Kennedy was some kind of martyr who was killed because he was too much of a threat.
Not at all. He's more interested in analyzing what Kennedy actually did, his documented decisions, the actions of his administration.
Right, sticking to the fact.
Exactly, rather than speculating about what might have happened.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, let's focus on what we can actually prove.
And be wary of those theories that rely on, just conjecture and rumors. It's a good approach.
Yeah, it's a refreshing approach, especially in a world where everyone loves a good conspiracy theory.
Right. It's easy to get swept up in that stuff. But Chomsky reminds us to stay grounded, to base our understanding on real evidence.
Okay, so to bring it back to the book, what are some of the big takeaways from Chomsky's analysis of the Kennedy era?
One of the biggest is how important it is to challenge those conventional narratives, those dominant interpretations of history, especially the ones that portray the U.S. as this inherently benevolent force in the world.
Right, the good guys.
He reminds us that history is always written from a particular perspective, often the perspective of those in power.
So we have to dig deeper, look at the evidence, consider those alternative viewpoints.
Exactly, especially the voices that are often silenced or marginalized.
He's calling for us to be more informed and engaged citizens.
That's what it's all about.
And that's especially important when it comes to issues of war and peace. Chomsky reminds us that wars have these devastating consequences, not just for the people directly involved,
Right.
but for the whole world.
He really drives that point home.
He wants us to think about why these wars happen, who benefits from them, and to be cautious about the narratives used to justify them.
It's a powerful message, and it's something we should all be thinking about, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. It's a message that resonates now more than ever.
It really does.
It's kind of like we've opened Pandora's box with this deep dive.
Yeah.
And one thing that's really unsettling is how relevant Chomsky's analysis of propaganda feels, even now, all these years later.
It's crazy, right? Like, he predicted how information would be weaponized in the digital age.
Yeah, we're drowning in messages, narratives, spin coming from everywhere.
It's not always straight up lies, though. That's the thing.
Right.
What Chomsky's talking about is this subtle way they shape our perception, this manufacturing of consent, he calls it.
Manufacturing of consent.
It's hard to even notice it happening.
And he says, it's not just about controlling what we think, but like controlling what we even think about.
Exactly.
The media might not be telling us outright lies, but they get to decide what they emphasize, what they downplay, what they just completely ignore.
They set the agenda, right?
Like they set the agenda.
They decide what issues even get talked about and how we talk about them.
And that's powerful.
So powerful because it shapes public opinion and that influences policy decisions.
So that's how consent is manufactured, even in democracies. It's not through force, it's through this manipulation.
Exactly. This subtle manipulation of information and perception. It's sneaky, but it's effective.
And Chomsky even says that we become part of the problem sometimes. Like, we censor ourselves without even realizing it.
Right, because we absorb those dominant narratives, they become like common sense to us.
It's like we're breathing in these ideas. They're everywhere, so we don't even think to question them anymore.
And that's why Chomsky is so important. He gives us the tools to break down those narratives, to see through the propaganda.
He helps us think for ourselves.
Exactly. to develop a more critical understanding, a more independent view of the world.
So it's not about being cynical and rejecting everything.
No, it's about healthy skepticism.
Right, healthy skepticism.
Having a critical eye so you can see through the spin, the manipulation.
And it means we got to be more proactive, not just passively consuming whatever's thrown at us.
You got to be active participants in the information landscape.
And that means being intentional, right? Seeking out different perspectives, challenging our own biases.
Yeah, being open to uncomfortable conversations, things that make us think.
It's like we have to become media detectives.
I love that, media detectives.
Yeah, constantly analyzing what we're seeing, who benefits from this, what voices are being silenced.
Asking those tough questions.
Because that kind of critical thinking is crucial, not just for understanding the world,
right,
but for making good decisions as citizens, as human beings.
Absolutely.
So what's the takeaway here for the average person, someone just trying to navigate this crazy world?
I think the biggest takeaway is we can't afford to be passive anymore. We have to be active, engaged, and critical in our thinking.
We can't just sit back and let the world happen to us.
We have to question the narratives, look for those alternative perspectives, be willing to challenge those in power.
It's not about having all the answers.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions, staying curious, and never stop learning.
And remember, you're not alone in this.
Yeah, there are tons of people out there who are fighting for truth, for justice, for a better world.
Chomsky's work gives us a framework, a way to understand these challenges and the tools we need to overcome them.
Well, I think this brings us to the end of our deep dive into Chomsky's Rethinking Camelot.
Wow, time flies when you're having fun and challenging your worldview.
It's been a wild ride, So many thought-provoking ideas, challenging concepts, and I think it's made us even more aware of how important critical thinking is, especially now.
It's crucial for being an engaged citizen.
Absolutely. And if you found this deep dive as interesting as we did, definitely check out Chomsky's full book.
There's so much more to unpack.
Yeah, it's packed with insights, and it'll keep you thinking long after you're done reading.
And remember, history isn't just something in the past. It's happening now.
Yeah, it's alive, and it's shaping our world every day.
We have to be critical, learn from the past, and work for a better future.
A future that's more just, more peaceful, more humane. That's the goal.
That's the goal.
So keep asking those questions. Keep challenging those assumptions. Keep searching for the truth. That's how we honor Chomsky's legacy.
Absolutely.
And that's how we create a world that's worthy of us all.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, folks.
Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.